we're going to keep going right along. Next up is Andrea Marston with Thieves of Patria, the vertical politics in Plurinational Bolivia. And I will hand the mic over to Jake for some amount of time.
Oh, yeah, some amount of time. Good. Yeah, put those cards away. Really? How many years has this been? After whatever? God dang. I remember talking to Andrea when she first was, applying here, and I just remember this person, this prospective student that seemed so earnest and so serious on the phone. We had these 2-hour conversations about why she should come to Berkeley and how she was going to plan her study and be out in 4 years, or if she wanted to get out in 4 years. I'm like, 5 maybe, let's be realistic, or whatever. And just really serious. And then as she arrived, I realized, as most of us have, behind the kind of sunny, smiling disposition, is this incredibly nuanced character. And I've come to know her, you, as this brilliant scholar, this vivacious soul with a dry wit, a taste for peaty whiskey, and really a smiling demolition force, that has transformed this department in a very real way. She was really instrumental in helping to reimagine what this department was, and also really making sure that it happened. Not just by being practically, but by being kind and also really forceful. Just like, things need to change here. And she embodies that demolition was brought to the end, was bringing to the end some of the worst of what the department habits we had, and she embodies some of the best of what the department is becoming. You've also changed me and my pedagogy, my scholarship profoundly, and you've become someone I trust. One of the first people I go to when there's a crisis, like, how do I figure out what to do in the department? I go, Andrea, I need a beer, I need to sit down and talk to you about this. And so she's kind of been a friend, confidant, and advisor, really, throughout the time here. And so I want to thank you for all of that you've done for us and for me. Dr. Marston came to us first by Duke University Environmental Studies program and environment and the International Studies program there, and then through UBC, where she worked with Karen Backer and Lila Harris and Juanita Sundberg, and she wrote a really brilliant dissertation on post-neoliberal natures around water politics in Bolivia. One of her recommenders wrote in her letter about Andrea, I know you get a lot of great students, and you probably hear all kinds of platitudes about those students, but Andrea is a real deal. If you take her into your program, she will not only write a brilliant dissertation, she will change your department. I kind of was rereading the letters. I'm like, I can imagine the kind of cynicism I read that with at the time. But as I was rereading it again last night, I was holding her dissertation in my other hand and thinking, this is exactly right. And it's also exactly right in relationship to the department. She's a remarkable scholar. She's gotten so many fellowships. We're thinking about asking her to fund the colloquium next year. She's gotten, along with we were the only departments in the country that got 2 ACLSs last year. She and our other friend from earlier today got the other one. She's also gotten 2 Trudeau Foundation scholarships, which is the most prestigious scholarship in Canada. And then a Trudeau Scholarship, and then 2 Shirks Tinker Grant, among others. I stopped counting the number of articles she has out now. I think 8, 9, I can't tell exactly, whatever, but the crazy number of articles for a graduate student, and also a book manuscript that's a dissertation manuscript, which with some limited amount of work will be an amazing book. So really, she's knocked it out of the park on all fronts, and she's also gotten the plum job on the market this year at Rutgers. She's going to start in the fall at Rutgers University in the Department of Geography there. The crown jewel of all this is, of course, her dissertation, The Vertical Politics. I don't know, again, what's the title now?
No, it's the same.
Okay, Thieves of Patria, Vertical Politics in Plurinational Bolivia. The dissertation really is a remarkable piece of work. She looks at the politics of small-scale miners who've been people have had a really hard time figuring out what their politics are. They've, almost a reactionary type of politics, when there's been a lot written about the leftist miners in Bolivia as being this powerful leftist force. Well, there's these tin miners who kind of run counter to that. And she's like, well, people don't know what to do with that. Explain it. A lot of people discount them. People kind of vilify them. All kinds of or people just try to ignore them. But in the kind of changing plurinational politics of Bolivia, she tries to tell a different story of it. And she tells that different story by really using a radically different method. So it starts with kind of a political ecology method, but she then takes and kind of expands or transforms that to kind of, through histories of race, histories of nationalism, through thinking about science, technology, studies, to really rethink and rewrite and make a historical materialism. But the materialism is radically different, so it's a different historical materialism, which is able to incorporate a whole different set of aspects of politics of race, nationalism into historical materialism and political economy. In many ways, I think about her work as this remarkable connection between certain earlier forms of political ecology and changing forms of political ecology, and a kind of a new form, drawing on a whole different set. She's really the red thread or the missing link between earlier forms of political ecology and some of the new forms that are evolving now. Which makes it a really quite remarkable work in many aspects. Say two other things about Andrea. One is it's pretty remarkable if you think about it. Look at Andrea. Imagine her going to work in the mines of Bolivia, and not just in the mines interviewing people above ground or in offices, but actually literally going deep underground with all kinds of miners and showing up in Bolivia, like the amount of attention and difficulties that happen. And a number of professors said, "Are you sure this is a good idea? Like, is this going to be okay?" I'm like, "No, I don't." But I sent her off anyway. I mean, irresponsible, No, but I also know her force and her strength, and the ability to carry out and do this work in the way she does. This also speaks to her. She's disarming, kind, smile, but with a force behind it, and a sensibility behind it that really is just disarming and makes all kinds of things happen. And she made that happen, kind of a stubborn bravery that is Andrea. I also just say there's the alluded to before about how she's helped change the department, and that's partly her, and it's partly her working not just for herself or by herself, but in a collective. There's a collective group of students who kind of formed a powerful collective that really lobbied and moved the department, and she's at the heart of helping make that collective happen and maintain that collective. And again, I feel deeply grateful for the transformations and the cultures and the practices of this department. So thank you for your brilliance, for your dedication to changing the world and this department, and to your friendship. All right, go, take it away.
Oh my gosh. This is on now. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today, and thank you, Jake, for that wonderful introduction. I was going to start by telling an anecdote about how when I started this PhD, I told Jake I was going to be done in 4 years, and he said something along the lines of, "We'll see." And then I was going to thank him for never once saying, "I told you so," in 7 years. But never mind. He was just saving it up. So I also want to thank the rest of my dissertation committee and qualifying exam committee, Michael Watts, Donald Moore, Nancy Postero, and Jill Hart, and to all the faculty, staff, and graduate students who are part of my community over the last 7 years. In particular, shout outs to my cohort, my fabulous gang of 5, none of who are here right now, but are here with me in spirit, and my writing group. Thanks to my parents for putting up with this very extended academic sojourn, and most of all, thank you to Jesse and Akita for reminding me every day that there is more to life than Latin American politics and tin mines. But despite that lesson, my talk today will be entirely about Latin American politics and tin mines. Rather than trying to summarize my dissertation, I will be framing it today in relationship to political ecology, since that's the field I've been hired to work in, so here we go. My focus will be on the relationship between subterranean space and the embodied formation of tin miners in Bolivia. I'm going to be walking you through a story that connects labor deep in the bowels of the earth to Bolivia's national political economy and even global geopolitics. But before that, a roadmap. I'm going to begin with my conceptual contributions, the context in which I work, and my methodology. Next, I'll work through ethnographic and archival material from highland Bolivia, where thousands of independent and mostly indigenous miners continue to work in a tin mine that was officially shut down in the 1980s. And the analytic triad I'll be using in this section includes vertical space, geological matter, and social differentiation. And finally, I'll circle back to elaborate the stakes of my two conceptual interventions, one of which speaks to debates about the endurance of resource-dependent economies, and one of which relates directly to political ecology. And so, without further ado, part one, introduction. So I work with small-scale miners known in Bolivia as cooperativas mineras, or mining cooperatives, although, as I'll show you today, there's nothing particularly cooperative about them. I think about mining cooperatives in relationship to the multiply constituted political left in Latin America. In the early 2000s, Latin America was awash in a so-called pink tide, which refers to the prevalence of elected officials proclaiming themselves to be some configuration of socialist, environmentalist, pro-indigenous, and for the people, or pueblo. But a central tension ran through all of these administrations. Despite declarations of support for indigenous sovereignty, state-controlled resource extraction was deepening across the region. Bolivia was, and remains, a paradigmatic example of this tension. In Bolivia, indigenous values have been discursively absorbed into the state apparatus and regurgitated in pro-extractivist propaganda, as you can see here in this mural, which features a picture of Che Guevara, a helmeted miner, and the phrase vivir bien, or live well. Vivir bien is borrowed from the indigenous Aymara concept of summa camana, which is meant to describe development that is measured not by continuous economic growth, but by the attainment of sustainable, healthy lives for all. Industrial mining to live well, as it says here, is completely at odds with environmentalist interpretations of summa camana, but it makes perfect sense in the town where I took this photo, which is a stronghold of cooperative miners. In ways similar to that mural, cooperative miners embody the tensions between indigenous politics and resource extractivism. As primarily indigenous miners, they have been involved in both pushing for territorial autonomy and the exploitation of non-renewable natural resources. Throughout my work, I take seriously the political economic principle that economies are shaped by people who are in turn shaped by their relations of production. In other words, we should be able to speak to the endurance of Bolivia's extractivist economy by examining the everyday labors of those who support it. By studying the formation of cooperative miners in relation to the material natures with which they work, I'm extending several key themes that run through political ecology. Since its emergence, this field has been characterized by a broadly historical materialist concern with how nature, society, and space are produced in and through one another. By and large, these works have emphasized the role of resource materiality in relations of production, and particularly the production of socioeconomic class. Although feminist political ecologists centered the domestic sphere and gendered dimensions of resource access, the field as a whole is just beginning to engage the racial and intersectional politics of nature, with of course several notable exceptions such as Carolyn Finney, Laura Polito, and Charlene Mollett. My research differs from the majority of political ecology in that the nature with which I'm concerned, rocky subterranean nature, surrounds workers on all 6 sides. This means that the production of space and socio-natural difference takes place along a vertical as well as a horizontal axis. My central contribution to political ecology, then, is to tip the whole field on its side. In brief, I examine the co-production of vertical space, geological nature, and a society divided on long lines of race and gender as well as class. So in this talk, I'm going to be toggling a lot between contemporary, historical, and conceptual points, but this is the triad to pay attention to: verticality, geology, and the production of social difference. And now, in a certain way, verticality is actually a very old theme for political ecology. Even Blakey and Brooksfield's early work was devoted considerable attention to calculating the slope of land in relation to lost topsoil. More relevant to my purposes, Carl Zimmerer has written about the vertical organization of ayllus, which are Andean indigenous territorial communities that I'll be referring to a lot today, so put ayllus into your head. Make use of irrigation terraces and the full range of alpine microclimates to maximize production. So llamas and sheep in the highest altitudes, potatoes, quinoa, and vegetables in the highland plateaus, and fruit in the valleys. Despite such elevation-driven studies, however, interest in verticality has been mostly limited to the soil rather than the subsoil, or altitude rather than depth, with a handful of exceptions here too, such as Bruce Braun's work on the production of vertical territory in Canada. In the last 5 years, this landscape has changed. Across multiple disciplines, there has been something of a convergence on vertical space and geological matter. This crowd includes architects, geographers, media studies scholars, and anthropologists, among others. But for political ecologists, this vertical vein could run much deeper. Explicitly conceiving of nature as part of three-dimensional space makes it easier to see how nature and society are vertically uneven. Working in the underground, for instance, entails a familiarity with the physical and chemical properties of rocks, as well as their processes of economic and sociocultural valuation. All these characteristics change depending on how deep you go. Perhaps most importantly, verticality is at the heart of struggles over political sovereignty, which is a central concern for Indigenous nations and other minority groups, as well as for the political ecologists working with them. Since the ILO's adoption of the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention in 1989, nation-states around the world have been cracking open the possibility of granting territorial autonomy to Indigenous peoples. But what appears to be a benevolent gift from the state is often only soil deep. In many Latin American countries, including Bolivia, the subsoil belongs to the state. Thinking vertically into the subsoil raises the question of whether your sovereignty is really about gaining access to surface control of surface level land, or if it has more to do with territory in a three-dimensional sense, extending all the way into the earth. Although this question is relevant in contexts as diverse as the US, Australia, and Brazil, it's particularly salient in contemporary Bolivia. Since the adoption of a new constitution in 2009, Bolivia has been officially considered a plurinational state rather than a regular nation state. This transformation describes a reorganized relationship between the state and Bolivia's many indigenous nations, which actually make up the majority of the country. Rather than a recognition of indigenous peoples by the state, which is what happens in multicultural contexts, the idea is that the plurinational state itself is indigenized. One state should thus be able to articulate multiple nations. This is the pluri and plurinational. The indigenization of the Bolivian state is embodied in its leader, President Evo Morales, pictured here on the right. He's the country's first indigenous identifying president. And on the left is a picture of his second inauguration, which was held at Tiwanaku, which are the oldest set of indigenous ruins in the country, and are still very deeply meaningful. Since Morales' first election in 2005, Bolivia has been heralded as a place of hope for indigenous and environmentally sustainable futures. The new constitution recognizes Pachamama, or Earth Mother, and calls for politics to be guided by the principle of, quote, harmony with nature and defense of biodiversity. But, as I hinted earlier, Morales' government is neither particularly green nor particularly pro-indigenous. Since he came to power, resource extraction has increased dramatically in a country already notorious for its resource-dependent economy. Natural gas, silver, tin, gold, and zinc have underwritten all of Morales' social programming for the last 13 years. This extraction has been driven primarily by the state, often in partnership with transnational corporations. The one exception to this rule are mining cooperatives, which are constitutionally recognized as productive actors in the mining sector. Exclusion from the realm of subterranean resource extraction has been frustrating for indigenous federations, which are actually not legally allowed to participate in mining or resource extraction, though this is not for lack of trying. In 2013, the Highland Indigenous Federation CONAMAC made a failed attempt to acquire the right to community mining within indigenous territories. Felix Becerra, that's him on the left, he was the leader of CONAMAC in 2013, and he explained in an interview that the struggle for communitarian mining was always about the struggle for indigenous sovereignty through three-dimensional territory. So as he put it, We have rights to all of our resources. In 2006, we were already proposing communitarian mining, but in reality, we don't care what it's called. What's important is the idea of indigenous communities. We administer exploitation. It's territorio hasta abajo, territory all the way down. Becerra's political vision shreds any romantic notion that indigenous peoples are necessarily opposed to non-renewable resource extraction. More importantly, for my purposes, it also gives form to the concept of vertical territory as directly connected to sovereignty. Most people write about Bolivian plurinationalism as a horizontal reorganization of relationships between the state and indigenous territories. But the vertical space of the underground is critical to interrogating the limits of plurinationalism. These limits trace the border between the soil and the subsoil, below which plurinational politics are overridden by extractivist demands. Now, I work with cooperative miners, not indigenous federations, but the truth is that they're often the same people. Indeed, cooperative miners call themselves agromineros, or agricultural miners, to highlight their connections to both agrarian and extractive economies. In addition to being members of their mining cooperatives, they're also usually members of indigenous ayllus or peasant unions, and very often both. But before I go any further, I need to make one thing very clear. These are not cooperatives in the way you are likely imagining. They are more like guilds of independent miners who have banded together to gain legal access to mining concessions. Profits are not shared across the cooperatives, which means that one member might grow wealthy while another works for years at a loss. Moreover, those who do get lucky sometimes hire third-party workers to labor on their behalves, outsourcing their risk and increasing socioeconomic inequality within the cooperative. Finally, although mining cooperatives operate with the state's blessing, they pay minimal royalties and no taxes while also failing to comply with environmental labor standards. For all these reasons, Bolivians often describe cooperative miners as plunderers, bloodsuckers, and thieves. Thieves of Patria, nation, which is the title of my dissertation. But the reality is more complicated. So methodologically, I'm drawing on 18 months of fieldwork in Bolivia, half of which was spent conducting ethnographic research with cooperative tin miners in the towns of Yayagua and Uncilla in the region of northern Potosí. So this whole red blob is the Department of Potosí, but the arm that sticks upwards is northern Potosí. And this is an highlight of that area. And the region of northern Potosí is known throughout Bolivia for the strength of its ayllus. As I said, ayllus are vertically organized indigenous communities, and they exist throughout the Andean highlands, but only in northern Potosí have they remained consistently active through 500 years of colonial and republican rule. And so all of these dotted lines here are divisions between ayllus, so you can see the whole territory is covered. Yayagua and Uncilla are located on the opposite sides of the Juan del Valle mountain, which is the red triangle. Tin mined in the Juan del Valle mountain floated Bolivia's national economy from 1899 to 1985. For the majority of this time, Yayagua and Uncilla were home to some of the most militant labor unions in the world. But in 1985, neoliberal restructuring resulted in the closure of the State Mining Corporation. And since then, Yayagua and Uncilla have instead been home to 7 mining cooperatives that collectively have around 2,000 members. And they're part of a nationwide wave of mining cooperatives created since the 1980s, which currently has over 200,000 people, not including the extended family members. And in a nation of only around 7 million, that's quite a large percentage. So this photograph is taken from the top of the Juan del Valle mountain looking down on Yayagua. And it looks very picturesque, but these large beige hills that you can see are actually about 18 tons worth of slag or waste rocks that were deposited, left behind over about a century's worth of mining. And they extend way beyond what you can see in this photo. And then this is what they look like on the ground. In the foreground is a picture of the tin concentration plant, which is still in operation today. So as a participant observer and interviewer in Yayagua and Uncilla, I regularly accompanied cooperative miners in their underground labors, crawling through tunnels so narrow that it was impossible to turn our helmeted heads sideways. I also spent time with cooperative miners in their homes, on their family farms, in political meetings, and I visited them in prison. When I was not in Yayagua Uncilla, I was traveling throughout the Bolivian highlands, conducting interviews with policymakers, geologists, labor unionists, and environmental activists, and working in public and private archives. And I hope you can get a sense of the texture of some of these places in this next section geosocial formations. In early March 2017, I joined Egberto, the 52-year-old cooperative miner pictured here on the left, for a full day of labor in the Juan del Valle mountain. We spent much of the morning on our hands and knees in a tunnel that had recently been dynamited. Our task was to separate the freshly dislodged rocks into two piles, those that contained tin ore and those that did not. Egberto reached around my leg to show me what to look for. "This is a good one," he said, dropping the rock into my hand. It was surprisingly heavy and had a visibly thick streak of black ore on one side. "It's at least 55 or 60% tin," Egberto said approvingly. "But this one," he showed me another rock for comparison, "is less than 30% tin. It's cara," he said, chuckling a little. Cara is the Quechua word for bald or naked, but it's also a derogatory term for non-indigenous Bolivians, whose paler skin and proximity to foreign powers have left them culturally naked. In the cara rock, the black streak was lighter, with an almost orange-red hue. It was stannite, a tin sulfide that makes the water inside the mine run orange. Egberto and his compañeros avoid this kind of low-grade rock underground as much as they might avoid a cara Bolivian on the surface. So in this section of the presentation, I'll be using the phrase geosocial formation to talk about cooperative miners and their mountain. And I'm borrowing the term geosocial formation from cultural geographers Catherine Yusof and Nigel Clark, who use it to refer to the planetary co-production of geological and social forces, i.e. how geology has been both the enabling and limiting condition of capitalist modernity. But my use of this term is distinct. Following a long political ecological tradition of exploring the grounded politics of labor, I use the concept geosocial formation to think through the relationship between geological materiality and uneven social fracturing along lines of gender, race, and class. In other words, I'm less interested in capitalist modernity than in the ongoing grounded production of social difference and its political consequences. So with that in mind, let's circle back to the Juan del Valle mountain and the origins of the mine. When Bolivian prospector Simón y Patiño, pictured here on the left, discovered a massive vein of black ore in his tiny mining concession in the Juan del Valle mountain in 1899, he apocryphally whispered to himself while he waited for the lab results, "Que no sea plata, please don't let it be silver." Although silver had been the backbone of Bolivia's colonial and republican economy for the previous 400 years, Patiño was hoping for tin. At the turn of the 20th century, this ancient metal was newly valuable in the industrializing North. Suddenly, it was needed in bearing metal, in dye fixatives, in weapons production, and most importantly, in the canning industry. Unlike most metals, tin does not oxidize when exposed to air or water, and it was needed to package food for urbanizing populations and armed forces. The whole world was on a hunt for tin. In celebration of the modernizing promise of his tin mine, Patiño named its most important section Siglo XX, or 20th century. Well into the 21st century, this name rings strangely anachronistic, but it is still attached to the region's largest mining cooperative, the local university, the richest mine shaft, and the section of town that was once worker housing. The name also fits the metal, such a fundamental ingredient of 20th century capitalism. Now, geologically speaking, the Juan del Valle mountain is actually more like two mountains, one inside the other, each with its own history. This was explained to me by Ruben, a geologist based at La Yayagua's local university, and this is him here, with the help of a yellowed map and a notebook. So in the middle you can see Ruben's drawing of the mountain as if you were looking down on it from above. The middle part is the inner core, and then the outer rock. And he explained to me that the outer rock, the outer layer is the sedimentary rock, which was formed from silt hardening on the bottom of a Triassic lake. Inside the mountain, however, the inner part is called the stock, and that was formed as an igneous intrusive. That is, stock was formed of magma that was cooled underground instead of reaching the surface. And the red blob on the last map is also a picture of the stock, which is sort of the heart of the Juan del Valle mountain. Ruben explained that the stock is like a criadero, or nursery of tin. The metallic veins in the stock are predominantly cassiterite, which is the most valuable tin compound, also known as stannic oxide. Cassiterite is relatively pure and has only to be shaken loose from the surrounding rock before it can be sent to the smelter. In the sedimentary rock, however, the mineral content of the veins changes from cassiterite to stannite, a sparkly but worthless tin sulfide. Stannite must be concentrated chemically before smelting, and usually the yields are lower. This is the Cara rock that Egberto and others avoid when they're working. Ruben also gave me this geological map to see what the distinction between the stock and the sedimentary rock looks like in cross-section. Like most underground mines, the Juan del Valle mountain is divided into horizontal slices, each about 30 meters high, that start from the peak, or level 0. The lowest workable level is about 800 meters down from the peak, level 800. Below that, there's just too much water to operate, even with pumps running 24 hours a day. The main mine shaft enters more or less right in the middle at level 412. So miners walk in and then they can take elevators going either up or down, although these elevators are a century old, and so many miners prefer to reduce their risk by climbing dozens of ladders instead. Tin-rich cassiterite can be found mostly at the lowest levels, at level 412 down across the whole mountain. In this lower region, the stock is the thickest, so that's where there's the most cassiterite. Today, there are 4 mining cooperatives that work underground and another 3 that work on the surface. Of the underground cooperatives, the largest one is called Siglo XX, or 20th century, and it holds this entire volume from level 412 down across the whole mountain. This is, again, where there's the most tin. 3 cooperatives share the upper levels of the mountain, where the tin found is mostly in stannite. Not only do they make less money than their compañeros in the cooperative below, but miners in these upper-level cooperatives are also exposed to more harm since they have to use more chemicals to process their ore. This inequality in earnings and contaminants is multiplied still further for the 3 cooperatives on the surface, and they process tin left behind in silt, slag, and sand. Obviously, this geosocial formation is uneven, but how it ended up this way is not just a matter of geology. When the prospector Simón y Patiño began processing tin in his mine in the Juan del Valle mountain at the turn of the 20th century, he was exploiting pure cassiterite. He built a railroad to move his ore as fast as possible. But the railroad workers, who arrived mostly from Chile and Argentina, shared their knowledge of Marxist and Trotskyist political theory with the Bolivian tin miners. Under their tutelage, Patiño's workforce quickly became the center of the national labor movement. And importantly, the great union leaders of this era, whose statues line Yayagua's main plaza, this is some of them here, they were all underground miners. These workers developed a reputation for bravery that very actively linked their risks underground to their willingness to take political risks on the surface. So this underground workforce was almost entirely male. But this should not be taken to mean that women were not employed at Patiño's mine. To the contrary, hundreds of women were employed on the surface as pairis, a job that involves separating by hand rocks that contained cassiterite from those that contained only stannite. On the left is a picture of a Pairis employee card. She was hired in 1928 at age 17 to work as a Pairi on the surface. So in this way, the subsoil was marked as a male space and the surface was reserved for women. This division continues today, as male miners still commonly assert that the metallic veins disappear when a woman shows up because Pachamama grows jealous. And in a similar way, in the early 1900s, a link was also formed between the tin mines and mestizaje, or the ideal of racial mixing upon which a unified Bolivian nation was imagined at the time. Patiño hired workers almost exclusively from the Cochabamba valleys rather than from the immediate vicinities, rather than from the Ayus. So as you can see in this employee file, he was born in Punata, which is in Cochabamba in the valleys, which is probably several days' travel from Yayagua at that point in time. Although these workers were from Cochabamba were Quechua speakers, they had been integrated into the wage labor force for generations, and they weren't considered indios in the same way that the residents of the Ayus were. They were Aymara speakers in the Ayus. These Quechua-speaking tin miners formed the vanguard of Bolivia's 1952 national revolution, and they came to stand in for the dream of mestizaje, in which indios could be transformed into citizens through separation from land, family, and language. Mestizaje was about cultural whitening more than literal racial mixing, and the grime of the mines proved an ironic whitening agent. The 1952 National Revolution resulted not only in the expropriation of Patino's mines for the state, but also in the legal reclassification of all Bolivians as racially mestizo. Indios became officially mestizo peasants, and criollos, or Bolivians descended from Spaniards, became mestizo professionals. So a country divided along racial lines became a country officially divided along class lines. And most importantly for my purpose, the deep subsoil of the tin mines was associated with this this nation-building project of mestizaje, while the surface land of the Ayllus was not. So today, every mining town across the highlands has a statue of a brawny, shirtless miner wielding a gun in one hand and a drill in the other. This is Yayagua's version of that statue. These are the two tools of Bolivians' imagined masculine mestizo future, modernity. But this dream rested on a foundation of cassiterite, an ore that wouldn't last forever. In Yayagua today, the word that cooperative miners most frequently use to describe the Juan del Valle mountain is agotara, exhausted, used up. Occasionally, miners also use the word to describe themselves, or more specifically their lungs, which weaken after years underground. But neither the mountain nor the people have experienced this exhaustion in equal measure. And I'm going to share some stories now that will illustrate how the material exhaustion of the mountain has shaped the social differentiation underground. One afternoon in February 2016, Clemente, a 36 leader of a mining cooperative in Yayagua, that's him on the left, invited me to ride up to the peak of the Juan del Valle mountain on his motorcycle. From there, he promised I would be able to see the lands of the Ayuchulpa, where he had been born and raised. Although Clemente's village was only a few hours' walk from Yayagua, few residents became miners. My father was of the generation that was scared of the mine, Clemente commented. There was a lot of discrimination back then, you know. Not just anyone could work in the tin mines. They didn't hire from the area. So I've already told you that Patino rarely hired workers from the Ayllus, but this was also true of the state mining corporation that replaced Patino after 1952. The national revolution that expropriated his tin mines had little impact on the socio-spatial division between the mines and the Ayllus. Ironically, it was the exhaustion of the mine and the neoliberal closure of the state corporation that fully pierced this barrier. When the mine was officially shut down in 1985, the laid-off miners were granted the right to continue exploiting the nearly exhausted mountain on their own dime. These miners enlisted the help of migrants from the Ayllus. The miners called the migrants mancucus, which is the Quechua word for the small green fruit produced by potato plants, to highlight their agricultural origins. So this picture on the left is from a locally produced comic that shows the history of mining cooperatives in Yayagua. And you can actually see a migrant from the Ayllus, marked by the tall pointy hat, which is called a chulu, being recruited by his friend with a miner's helmet into the cooperatives that were just forming at the time. So like many indigenous highlanders of his generation, Clemente's father joined a cooperative when it was first forming, and he worked as a mancucu. And when he died, Clemente took his place at age 16. But Clemente discovered a penchant for bookkeeping and quickly began taking on leadership roles, a feat that he managed while returning to his Ayllu to continue working the land. So on the right, this is a picture of a potato harvest with his family. As Clemente's story highlights, mancucus and their children did not always stay mancucos. The integration of Ayllu members into the cooperatives has happened gradually in some cases and by force in others. And just to briefly illustrate the latter, in 2005, several hundred members of Clemente's Ayllu actually occupied part of the mine, armed with guns and hoes. They declared themselves owners of the mountain since it was located within their traditional territory. And after a week-long struggle, this conflict was resolved with a vote and the admission of 100 Ayllu members into the cooperative, Siglo XX, so the largest cooperative. And it's worth noting that this kind of subterranean occupation happens so regularly in the Bolivian highlands that in 2013 a law was adopted that specifically prohibits mine invasion. So the struggle over the vertical dimensions of territorial sovereignty is really just getting going. But whether they entered mining cooperatives gradually or by force, Ayllu members have transformed the internal divisions of space and labor inside and outside the mountain. So now remember that mining cooperatives are not cooperatives in the usual sense. They don't redistribute profits across the cooperative as a whole. but they do redistribute profits within much smaller labor units called cuadrillas, which are kind of like work gangs. And each of these work gangs owns what's called a paraje, or work area. So the entire volume of this mountain is actually divided up into tiny little cubes, each of which is called a paraje and is owned by a different cuadrilla, which might be anywhere between 2 and 15 people. So you remember this cross-section of the mountain and this division between the cooperatives, but in practice, it actually looks much more like this, and not actually squares. This is what I could do with PowerPoint. But they're little areas of the underground that follow the veins of tin and are each owned by a little cuadrilla. And within each of these parajes, operations look a lot like a family farm. Cuadrilla members are very often, or almost always, related to each other. Nephews help out uncles, sons join their fathers, occasionally husbands and wives even work together. So these are 3 brothers who have been working together for decades. To see how this style of vertical family farming interacts with the exhausted geology of the mine, let's go back to Egberto, the miner with whom I introduced this section, and his cuadrilla. So Egberto, that's him again on the middle, I guess. He grew up in the Ayucaracha, and like Clemente's father, Egberto began working in the cooperatives soon after they were formed in the early 90s. He now works underground with his 30-year-old nephew, who's also from Caracha, and his 46-year-old cousin, Romalda, who's on the far left. All 3 are members of the cooperative 20 de Octubre, which is located in the upper levels of the mountain where there's not so much tin. Romalda is one of only about 10 women who work underground in the entire mountain, a right that she inherited when her husband abandoned her some 10 years ago. Membership within a cooperative is hereditary and traditionally goes to the eldest son, but Romalda had argued that her sons were too young. In the end, she'd been accepted because of her familial relationship with Egberto. It's broadly the case that newcomers to the cooperative have a hard time finding a work site without a family connection, since all the major veins have already been claimed. In these ways, relations of kin stretching out across the lands of the Ayus increasingly mediate access to the material remains of the underground. But Romalda is still something of a boundary crosser and an interesting figure to think with. In her above-ground life, she is de polleras, or of skirts, meaning that she wears the clothing of urban indigenous women, like on the left. Underground, however, she wears men's work clothing, rubber boots, jeans, long-sleeve shirts, and of course, helmet and lamp, like on the right. Romalda frequently jokes that she transforms herself every morning when she changes clothes. And because of this transformation, Romalda is considered a socio-cooperativista pairi, or a socio-cooperativista minera, rather than a socio-cooperativista pairi. And these words really matter, as Romalda and the other underground women frequently remind me, they are not pairis. But of course, the very hierarchical distinction between these figures emphasizes the gendered dimensions of the 2 realms, the above ground and below. And to be clear, this is not just a gendered transformation. Becoming male-like also implies becoming mestizo-like, since only women have recognizably indigenous clothing. These 2 categories always work together. Generally speaking, labor within a cuadrilla is distributed relatively equally across all members to ensure that no one is responsible for the most onerous tasks on a daily basis. In a cuadrilla of 3, for example, one member will operate the air compressor, middle photo, to send air to his 2 compañeros working the drill below. And so one has to hold the drill and the other kind of directs the end into the ground, if you can see from that photo. The next day, the 3 rotate their jobs, and this is a rotational labor practice that is actually inherited from the Ayus. But this arrangement is modified when there's a woman underground. Like most of the women who work underground, Romalda on the left spends most of her days with her hands in a bucket of water. She's washing rocks to determine which ones have enough ore to justify hauling them to the surface. This task is often assigned to women because it is deemed less physically strenuous than drilling, planting dynamite, or heaving sacks of overburden. Romalda sits on a ledge with a giant plastic tub, a large hose of gushing water, and a makeshift sieve. When they are washed, masses of dirt become clearly defined collections of stones, some sliced or peppered with crystals of tin. Romalda moves quickly, plucking the valuable stones from the rocky chaff and dropping them in a burlap sack. As we are talking, Romalda pauses to show me her hands, which are puckered, peeling, and splitting open from the cold acidic water. You can always recognize a miner from their hands, Romalda tells me, plunging hers back into the water, into the basin. Yet her hands are specifically those of a woman miner. If you remember that distinction between cassiterite and stannite, stannite is a tin sulfide. When rocks with high sulfide content are exposed to water and oxygen, they release hydrogen ions that substantially lower the water's pH. This is called acid mine drainage, and it's common to mining sites around the world. But in this mine, the water becomes more acidic the more miners exploit stannite veins. With the exhaustion of cassiterite deposits, exploiting stannite is precisely what these miners are being forced to do. And since women are the ones who are more likely to spend their days with their hands in the water, they're the ones who bear the brunt of this geological exhaustion. And this isn't the only way that women bear this geological burden. Nearly a year earlier, I had spoken with a doctor at the local hospital who mounted 3 x-rays of lungs with various stages of silicosis, or black lung, for me to examine. Scarring from silica dust showed up like a thickening mist, gradually turning the rib cages opaque. I asked the doctor if he had any x-rays of women's lungs. He shook his head and informed me that women are not susceptible to silicosis. At first he said this is because women do not do any drilling, which is the task that generates the most dust. When I informed him that I personally knew several women who had been drilling for decades but who could not convince his hospital staff to x-ray their lungs, he suggested that women have stronger bodies that fight against the impurities of silica. Apparently, scarred lungs are an attribute of real miners that women are not quite permitted to attain. Once again, the materiality of the underground interacts differently with different bodies, or at least is perceived to act differently in consequential ways. So what I've been trying to shed light on with all these stories of geological matter, vertical space, and corporeality is that mining cooperatives have emerged as geosocially differentiated formations in relation to the material world in which they work. The vertical space of the underground has its own uneven geology, and it has also been produced through this multiscalar history of tin mining. Encrusted with 20th century meanings of masculinity, mestizaje, and modernization, now mined with family rotational practices inherited from the Ayus, the subterranean tin mine shapes cooperative miners' bodies, internal hierarchies, and political aspirations. And that brings me to the third and final section, stakes. So as I said at the beginning, I study mining cooperatives in relation to the tense coexistence of plurinationalism and state-led resource extraction in Bolivia. And this tension is inadvertently highlighted in this billboard, which is advertising Bolivia's new satellite using the figure of Tupac Katari on the far left, who was an 18th century indigenous revolutionary. So this satellite was funded almost entirely with rents from natural gas and other subterranean resources. It's well documented that rampant extraction continues to dispossess indigenous peoples, thus violating the basic principles of plurinationalism. Rather than add my voice to this chorus by enumerating further instances of dispossession and socio-environmental conflict, my work shows how the people involved in pushing for resource extraction are produced in relation to the vertical depths of the underground, a place normally excluded from political economic and even political ecological analyses. Across my work, I show how the Bolivian subsoil has been produced as a fundamentally nationalist place. And it's in relationship to this place, its history and its materiality, that miners' interests are conceived, and later these interests are translated to the political arenas on the surface. And indeed, mining cooperatives are very influential figures in surface-level politics. They are members of parliament and senators. They sit on the board of the State Mining Corporation. They are involved in writing new mining laws, and they have a direct line of communication with the president. So as you can see in this picture, the president often makes appearances at events for cooperative miners. And when he does so, he always wears this backpack. It's called a queperina, and it's made out of potato sack, and it's actually the symbol of cooperative mining. This is how his sartorial way of coexisting with the people. Finally, when their political demands are not met, cooperative miners are more than willing to march in the streets with dynamite to shut off major transportation arteries. The threat of such violent protests often cows policymakers into accepting miners' demands. Quite frankly, cooperative miners scare people. This fear was palpable in August 2016, when miners from across the country erected a roadblock on a highway just outside of La Paz to protest changes to the cooperative law. This run-of-the-mill roadblock spiraled out of control when the Deputy Minister of the Interior showed up to negotiate. Instead of negotiating, cooperative miners took him hostage, beat him to death, and left his body on the road. One cooperative miner told me later that the guns they had taken to the roadblock were the ones their grandfathers had taken to the Chaco War, which is credited with igniting Bolivia's national spirit in the 1930s. They had the spit of the nation on them, he told me about the guns. This kind of logical reasoning, wherein indigenous miners use nationalist guns to fight for the right to exploit exhausted tin mines, has been made possible by the production of the subsoil as a nationalist space through labor politics and their representations. These are some of the histories I excavated today. So finally, I hope I made it clear how political ecology might be turned productively on its head to employ its conceptual tools in vertical and particularly subterranean space. As I said, there has been a convergence on the subsoil as a place of interdisciplinary interest, and political geology has become a catch-all term in this field. And on the left, you can see an edited volume of that title that was just released earlier this year. However, as of now, political geology has been running mostly parallel to rather than intersecting with political ecology. And this is a huge loss for both fields, as the questions with which political ecologists are most familiar are, or at least should be, also central to political geology. Here I'm talking about the ways that subterranean nature is unevenly territorialized through political, economic, colonial, and scientific practices, and how the gritty stuff of the underground, lodged under fingernails and embedded deep in lungs, produces socially differentiated societies. And I'm going to leave you, as Adam gives me the 1-minute mark, by very briefly identifying 2 areas of inquiry that stand to benefit from thickening connections between political ecology and political geology. So first, the Anthropocene. As we all know, by and large, studies of the Anthropocene have tended to privilege planetary scales of analysis and nearly always identify consumers of fossil fuel in the global north as the primary agents of geological change. By redirecting attention to production in the global south rather than consumption in the global north, political ecologists stand to offer a post-colonial corrective to this conversation. And second, the global resurgence of virulent forms of nationalism. These nationalisms, characterized by racist and masculinist forms of exclusion, depend on revived 20th century modernity stories that are fundamentally tied to particular representations of people and nature. Contemporary Latin American politics from Brazil to Colombia exemplify this trend. It's no coincidence that many of these nationalisms are rooted in traditional mining sites. Think of West Virginia or northern England, where exhausted geological futures continue to remind people of past possible futures, geological natures. Applied to vertical as well as horizontal space, political ecologists' granular attention to the interface between people and material nature has the potential to breathe new life into notions of global geopolitics. Thank you.